And welcome back. In this last portion of the course, I'd like for us to discuss what it means to live in a multicultural society. So, how does that relate to the study of race and ethnicity in anthropology? And then lastly, we will turn to the other piece that you were to have read for today's class by Lee Baker and thinking about um, the anthropology of race today. So I have two images here that I'm going to share with you. One, a salad, the other, stew. Melting pot or tossed salad. Which of these is representative of American society? Have you heard of this before? The idea of American society is a melting pot, right? Most students have heard of the melting pot idea. Fewer, however, have heard of the tossed salad analogy. So the next concept you'll need to know for this unit is multiculturalism. This is a framework in which, say, take a society like that of the United States, in which there is racial, ethnic, and cultural diversity. This is and under multiculturalism, the idea is that diversity is something that is good, that is desirable, that individuals, including immigrants, will be socialized into a dominant culture. We can think of that as like the salad dressing. Everyone in that society over time will become steeped in something around that dominant culture. But they also are encouraged even to hold on to their minority ethnic culture. For example, that's why we see difference. We see the different items in a salad. This is the opposite of what we call assimilationism. And haha, yeah, I made the dressing American dressing, just to make that analogy clearer. Okay, so again, this is in contrast to assimilationism. Under assimilationism, the idea is that diversity is understood as a problem, right? That it's the job of the state to somehow make all people fully assimilate into the dominant culture and to abandon their minority traditions and values. Hence the melting pot, right? The idea is it's like it becomes a fondue, like a pureed soup. Like it's all one color, it's all one consistency, and all that. Differences are lost to form something uniform. The melting pot, this is just like an interesting little fact. The melting pot is also the title of a very popular play on Broadway in 1908. In fact, it was one of the most popular Broadway plays on Broadway. It kind of takes the story of Romeo and Juliet um, and switches it out to tell the story, a love story between a Christian Russian immigrant and a Jewish Russian immigrant that have both moved to the United States. And the message of the play is that America is a place where these long-standing hatreds have no place, and that differences should be erased, and that in America we all are kind of one and the same. And you can see this actually in the playbill, like the image, right? It's like people are going past Statue of Liberty and falling into this pot where they all kind of melt into one. You see here also this kind of a violent metaphor, right? Because of course, when you're expected to abandon your minority traditions or culture, something is lost, right? So again, the idea is that one should essentially erase one's ancestral past or ethnic origins or racial background. Again, completely different from a multicultural perspective where the idea is you're just celebrate those differences. So in summary, race categories are social constructs. They're informed by culture and they vary across cultures. We saw that variation in the US versus Brazil. But they're also informed by politics and power. Ideas about race, are always informed by politics and power. Think about this in terms of the US and Brazil. Both of these are two societies that are informed by or born out of a history of slavery and anti-Black racism. But ideas about race change over time. Take the example of whiteness in the United States. We have very different models for addressing ethnic pluralism in the United States and other societies between a multicultural framework or assimilationist framework. Okay. This brings us to the final portion of the lecture. We're going to look at Lee Baker, his work. Okay, so if race isn't real, then can we finally stop using racial categories, right? This is something you'll hear students say, like, well, if race isn't real, then why are we being asked to fill our race out on a survey, for example? Okay. This is the question that Lee Baker is addressing in his work. And he says emphatically, no, right, that this is not going to work. What is Lee Baker arguing in this piece? I'd like for you to read this article carefully and take good notes, as you hopefully already have, I should say. What do you believe are the two most important sentences and points from this article? Can you list the two most important points from this article? I'm going to encourage you to go ahead and put those up in the Google Doc. So please pause this video and go ahead, open up the Google Doc and put in there with your name. What do you think are the most important points or sentences from this article? Okay, sorry. Pause there for a second. Okay, so Baker has a lot to share with us here. One thing he shares is that regarding the census, ultimately the census is not about identification, it's not about identity. He says social disparities such as healthcare, income, etc., can't be addressed if we ignore or erase all data or discussion on race. Essentially, what Baker is arguing here is that the census, by asking questions related to race, gives us as social scientists data to use so that we can understand, um, you know, uh, something about the experiences of peoples in that category. That having been said, if we don't have, excuse me, sorry, video froze for a second. That having been said, if we don't have access to this data, right, then we as social scientists simply do not know. For example, are there health disparities across racial categories, or aren't there? Or what about the relationship between income and disparity or equity and race, right? If we don't have that data, then we as social scientists can't determine the answers to those questions. Lee Baker writes that shifting the focus from race to ethnicity allows proponents of a so called colorblind society to ignore racism and explain these impacts in terms of culture, behavior, and lack of merit. Okay, let me read that again. Shifting the focus from race to ethnicity allows proponents of a so called colorblind society to ignore racism and explain disparate impacts in terms of culture, behavior, and lack of merit. So differences and disparities across racial lines then become no longer explained by racism, but by culture or behavior, right? This is simply another kind of racism. Right? This is a problem. Lee Baker also writes that the news media subverts progressive biological. Sorry, my puppy has a Barnaby. He ruined my headache apparatus. Oh goodness. Sorry. Let's say hi to the students. Hello. Hello. Okay. Sorry. I'll promise to get back on this lecture. So the news media, he writes, subvert progressive biological anthropologists' arguments about the inequity of biological concepts of race to advance a vulgar, colorblind thesis. Critical and cultural anthropologists are rarely called upon to explain that when biological categories of race are meaningless, social categories of race are very real, meaningful, and dictate life chances and opportunities. In other words, Baker is arguing here that it's really important for biological anthropologists to not simply say that race is, not a like true biological concept, right? Um, but it's also important for them to explain that racial categories and racial race itself is very real in terms of how it impacts people's lived experiences in places like the United States, right? So again, it's a this phenomenon in which race is not real, biologically speaking. There are not these clear, distinct boundaries across different races, but at the same time, it's very real in terms of its consequences for people. So again, we have this biological anthropologist here. I've created this cartoon who says, firm racial categories are not scientifically valid. Race is just a social construct. Okay, that's true. We know that from the research. And so what the media will then say is that, see, everyone, race doesn't exist. That's why I don't see color. Right? Of course, I'm picking on Honora O'Donnell here. Um, and then that leads to, for example, disparities in healthcare, racial disparities or biases in healthcare, right? When we take that idea that race isn't real and we simply take a colorblind view to it, instead of taking a social scientific view and seeing if people's racial identities or how they're read racially has an impact. Okay. And that, folks, is a wrap. I look forward to hearing your thoughts